As with all my video classes, my video sweater classes always have variations for an Eastern stitch mount. So this is a video that's going to look at a lot of stitches and what you would have to do if your stitch mount had its leading leg, the leg that's closest to the tip of the needle, sitting in the back of the needle. So first up, we have the knit two together, otherwise known as the single right slanting decrease. It involves column number 2 going on top of column number 1, which makes the stitch slant to the right. Let's take a look. The important thing to understand about decreases is whatever stitch your needle enters ends up on top, which designates the slant. And the important thing to understand about knitting is our needle has to go into the hole. So for an Eastern mounted stitch, the hole would involve my needle entering the back loop, not the front, which as you can see will twist the stitch. For a Western mounted stitch, the hole involves me entering the leading leg, which is sitting at the front of the needle, with the needle tips then ending up going in the same direction. If I entered the trailing leg, which is in the back, I would again twist my stitch. So, knowing that, how do I make a single right slanting decrease, which involves column number 1 sitting on top of column number 2? I have to remount my stitches, which involves slipping them through the leading leg to flip their stitch mounts around, put them back onto the needle, and then I can enter stitch number 2 and stitch number 1 and knit them together, and I get a single right slanting decrease. That will of course be no different whether you're picking or throwing. If I have my yarn in my left hand, I'm going to do the same thing. Remount the stitches by slipping them by their leading leg, put them both back where they came from, and then I'm able to enter column number 2 and then column number 1 to knit them together, and I get a single right slanting decrease. Next up, we have what's called the SSK in Western patterns, which is a single left slanting decrease. It involves column number 1 going on top of column number 2 and slanting to the left. So how do we make that? Now, knowing whatever stitch my needle enters ends up on top, and that we have to put the needle into the hole to create a single left slanting decrease, known as an SSK in Western patterns, that's column number 1 going on top of column number 2, in which case I do not have to remount the stitches at all, but simply knit 2 together through that leading leg, which is entering column number 1 and then column number 2, and voila, single left slanting decrease. Again, makes no difference whether or not you pick or throw, you're still entering column number 1 and then column number 2, and there you have a single left slanting decrease. A central double decrease, abbreviated as CDD, or in some older patterns, S2KP, is column number 2 ending up on top of column number 1 and 3, and it has no slant. Let's take a look. For a central double decrease, I need this middle stitch to end up on top. And remember, whatever stitch my needle enters ends up on top, but I also have to go through the leading leg. So the first step to a central double decrease is reverse the stitch mounts of the first 2 stitches, put them back where they came from. Then my trick to doing it easier and a little better is enter stitch number 2 and slip them off the needle as if to do a knit 2 together. They now reverse positions. Put them back where they came from, wiggle the tip of that needle into the 3rd loop, and again, whether you pick or throw, knit all 3 together, and you'll see what you have is 3 columns of stitches going into one with no slant, with the middle stitch ending up on top. The SK2P, standing for slip 1, knit 2 together, pass over, is a double left slanting decrease and involves the slip stitch overlapping the right slanting decrease, so visually it makes a double left slanting decrease. A double left slanting decrease involves stitch number 1 going on top of my decreased stitch number 2 and 3, which creates 3 stitches going into one and slanting to the left. Now the S of that stitch stands for slip. So let's pause for a second and talk about slipping stitches. In a Western pattern, when it just says slip, it means that it wants you to slip to maintain a Western stitch mount. Now this can be tricky if you are a combination knitter, because for a combination knitter, your stitches sit with a Western mount for the purl side and an Eastern mount for the knit side. Now often the reason in Western knitting you need to slip, like in mosaic knitting or slip stitch knitting, as if to purl, meaning to maintain the Western stitch mount as you move it, to maintain the leading leg in the same position, is because in the next row you are going to be working that stitch as a purl and you don't want to twist it. So what that means for a combination knitter is if you see slip and it doesn't say as if to knit, but it just says slip, as in slip stitch or mosaic knitting, what it means is slip to create a Western stitch mount. So for a combination knitter, you would slip that through the back leg, because there you can see when you turn that around to work it, your leading leg is where you need it to be. However, for decreases that involve passing a stitch over, you'll often see the instructions slip as if to knit. And the problem combinations knitters run into is this is the way they enter their stitch to knit. So slip as if to knit to a combination knitter could mean this. The problem with that is then when we go to pass that slip stitch over, what we visually get on the surface of our knitting is However, in Western patterns, when it comes to a decrease, you'll often hear the instruction slip as if to knit. And the purpose of that is to turn the stitch mount around to be Eastern. So when that stitch is passed over, it is left open. If a Western knitter slipped that stitch as if to purl and then later passed that stitch over, it would be twisted. However, for an Eastern or a combination knitter that already has their leading leg in the back, think of slip as if to knit as slip to maintain the stitch Eastern mounted. So that being said, the SK2P stands for slip one, which you will do by maintaining that Eastern mount, but then knit two together. You could knit them together through their leading leg and then pass this stitch over, and you will in fact get a left leaning decrease with 3 stitches going into one leading to the left. If you find that that looks a bit poofy or doesn't match visually what the picture in the pattern is doing, it's because a Western knitter is making these 2 stitches a right slanting decrease and then covering this up. So if you wanted to recreate that stitch exactly, you would slip this to maintain the Eastern stitch mount, reverse, reverse, put them back where they came from, knit 2 together, and pass the slipped stitch over. And there you have 3 columns of stitches going into one, slanting to the left. But what it's covering up is a right slanting decrease. Some knitters think that looks a bit neater in lace. Its pair is the knit 3 together, which involves 3 stitches going into one, slanting to the right. When it comes to a knit 3 together, 3 columns of stitches going into one, slanting to the right, there's no way around it. All 3 stitch mounts have to be reversed. However, after you put them back on the needle, what I like to do is, instead of entering column number 3, which can get a little tricky and a little hard to maneuver, I like to start with a knit 2 together, much easier to accomplish. Put that back where it came from and pass the 3rd stitch over. Return that back to the right needle, and there you have a knit 3 together. 3 stitches going into one, slanting to the right. A knit front and back loop, KFB, creates visually what looks like a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch. It's an increase. So next, it's time to talk increases. If you see an increase that's abbreviated KFB or KFBL, that stands for knit front and back loop. But what it really means is knit 1 stitch open and the next stitch twisted. So that's why for a Western mount, you knit into the front of the loop and then pivot around and go into the back of the loop. Again, as with most things, doesn't really matter whether you're picking or throwing, it's the same stitch. Go into the front loop and then pivot around and go into the back loop. So what that means for an Eastern mounted stitch, if you're going to knit 1 stitch open and 1 stitch twisted, is you'll be knitting back front loop. There's my open stitch, and I pivot around and I enter, as what you can see is the trailing leg, and I'll twist that next stitch. And what that gives me visually is a knit stitch followed by a purl stitch. You have that little purl bump. Again, it is no different If you have your yarn in your left hand, I'm going to be entering my leading leg, and then without removing that stitch, I'll pivot around and I'll enter my trailing leg. And that's a knit back and front loop. A yarn over is an increase made between two stitches when the yarn travels over the needle before working the next stitch. And that again, that doesn't matter whether you pick or throw, whether your yarn's in your right hand or your left hand. The issue for combination knitters is I'll often be asked, which direction do we have to wrap the yarn? Because combination knitters have been told to worry about whether or not they knit or purl that in the next row. The only difference between a yarn over and a knit one is, do you work into the leading leg to maintain the hole, or do you work into the trailing leg to twist it? So it doesn't matter which way you wrap the yarn over. You can wrap it either way that's comfortable. There is a video on better matching yarn overs, and that's a different trick. But the issue is when you work back over them. In order to make sure that I'm getting a yarn over and not a make one, I have to work into that leading leg. So let's take a look. Again, it doesn't matter whether I'm picking or throwing. If I come to a yarn over, and there it is, and I am a combination knitter who's used to working into the front loop when I purl, and I do that, I will get a make one, not a yarn over. Now, if you're an Eastern knitter, this looks right to you because that's where you always put the needle. So it doesn't matter whether I'm picking or throwing. It matters where I put my needle. So if I wanted a yarn over, that needle has to go into the hole. If I had wrapped my yarn the other way, and there's another yarn over, and there's my leading leg sitting at the front of the needle. If I'm an Eastern knitter who's used to purling into the back loop, and I purl this way, I will of course get a make one, not a yarn over. So whether or not you're Eastern or a combination knitter, the important thing in yarn overs is to put the needle in the hole, and that's how you will actually get yarn overs. Make ones and lifted increases are the same regardless of your knitting method, because that's not working into a stitch, but rather into the row below or into the running bar. So no difference. Purl decreases, the purl two together or the SSP, will be no different if you're a combination knitter, because your leading leg will be in the same place as a Western knitter. However, if you're an Eastern knitter and you wrap the yarn differently, when you knit, different from a Western knitter or a combination knitter, your leading leg is still sitting at the back of the needle for purl. So remember, whatever stitch your needle enters ends up on top. So a purl two together is to create a right slanting decrease on the public side. And in Western knitting, it is done by entering stitch number 1 and stitch number 2. But for an Eastern mount, that would twist our stitches. So if you see a purl two together, that means you have to slip, slip to reverse the stitch mounts. And then you can simply insert the left needle into the back loop and you're ready to go for your purl two together, which creates, let's just take a look at it on the other side. There you are, a single right slanting decrease on the public side, 2 stitches going into one, slanting to the right. But if you see an SSP, that involves entering column number 2 first. So in Western knitting, that's where the stitch mounts have to be reversed. But here you're ready to go. So you're going to enter the leading leg of stitch number 2 and then wiggle that around into stitch number 1. And you can purl them together. And again, as always, it doesn't matter whether you have your yarn in your left hand or your right hand. The stitch is still the same. Entering column number 2 and then column number 1 and purling them together. And what that makes is a left slanting decrease on the public side. 2 columns of stitches going into 1, slanting to the left. So I hope that helped. For more information about combination and Eastern knitting, do check out my Craftsy class, Improve Your Knitting Alternative Methods and Styles.